This video is 5 years in the making and not for the reasons you might think, and no, it's not sponsored. Now, I use Luna, but almost all of this workflow could theoretically be applicable to any DAW. So if you're just curious about what these SSL devices can do, then you're in the right place. Now, that said, I really wanna know, what do you guys think of the layout? What do you guys think of the feature set that I've included? So if you spot something cool, leave a comment below and let me know. But most importantly, just watch. With that said, in this video, I'm excited to introduce and walk through version 5 of my UF Series Luna control profile. This refined workflow update unlocks advanced functionality that isn't possible out of the box or by using standalone MCU functions. Now that's thanks in large part to the Universal Audio devs for introducing the keyboard shortcuts editor. Remember the whole 5 years thing? Well, that's a feature that we needed in order for this to happen. Couple that with the SSL devs unlocking different areas of the devices, and that's taken a few years. For all my Luna Master Course members, you can get this V5 Advanced template today. And for everyone else looking to take your Luna knowledge to the bleeding edge of its capability as a DAW, check out my official Luna Master Course at thestevekinney.com. With it, you get a dedicated knowledge base of course material that updates as Luna evolves. So anytime there's a new feature, you're gonna get a dedicated spot to go and learn about it. In addition to the knowledge base, you get both my advanced SSL control profile and my Luna Stream Deck profile as part of being a course member, so you can learn with the tools that I use right alongside me. Check it out today. I'd love to see your progress. If you just like this workflow and you want to get it for yourself, you can get it at thestevekinney.com. With that out of the way, let's get started and let's talk about the theory behind the layout and what I've done here. The first thing that comes to mind right out of the gate is reducing redundancy and why some redundancy is a bit necessary. But really the goal is to try to have as much one-to-one control as possible. Because there's so much on these devices, not only that you can do, but also just to look at, having as much one-to-one dedicated purposes for parts of your controller is what is gonna help you get into a flow and a muscle memory with your devices and ultimately actually makes it efficient to work on. And the first step in trying to make these devices have as much one-to-one control as possible is identifying what is static and what is dynamic. And what I mean by that is, what parts of this controller can you really change regularly? And well, obviously that's the soft keys here, but there is another component, and that's the channel encoder. Those kind of can be changed on the fly, as well as this channel right here. It has this master mode, and that's gonna be key in making both of these devices work together in a way that doesn't have as much overlap, because ultimately there's a few things on this device that are repeating. And I know that people have asked about it before, but for example, the automation section here, you have one here and you have one right in here when you jump into the shift mode, right? So that's redundant. So if I have this device, I'm never gonna really access these keys. That's just one example. Another example is the channel selector keys and the channel encoder here. So ultimately there's a few configuration choices at the very, very top of this that I wanna get out of the way. The first being is this master fader button. I wanna give this fader a job, okay? So I'm gonna throw it into master fader mode. And now on screen here, you can see that this obviously has a job, but you might be noticing on the UF8 that this fader is now still being redundant. Well, that's because there's a setting within Luna that we need to change. So if we hop into the controller section in Luna, there is this show main track option. And if we disable it now, you'll see that the SSL UF8 has reset. There are no tracks or channels on the UF8, and my channel on the UF1 now has a very specific job independent of my UF8. Now, we already quickly talked about the automation on the UF8 and how we're not really ever gonna jump into the automation mode on the UF1. So we're just gonna leave these keys to have a very dedicated job, which we'll talk about in a bit. The next configuration function is gonna be visibly demonstrated a bit better later on, but I'll just talk about it briefly. It's this channel select knob. So if you hold this down, there are 4 modes that you can assign to this channel selector, and they overlap with some of the modes on this channel selector. Again, I can demonstrate this better in a bit. What I like to do for this device is to leave it in focus mode. And that's actually my preferred way of interacting with plugins with these devices. And it's cool because I can just leave it up all the time with this device. Now, navigation can be handled with this jog wheel, so why would I have it anywhere else? Which means that on this channel encoder, I'm never going to use the nav button. I'm just gonna leave it on either the nudge or on nothing. And that gives us two really key functions. And finally, as it relates to the soft key banks themselves, since those are dynamic, now we get into the idea of trying to work linearly throughout your session using these devices, because the last thing you want to do is be menu surfing where you're jumping back and forth between the pages. Now that's going to be inevitable to some degree because you can only fit so many shortcuts on a page. And so you really have to think a lot about how you want to lay this out. Now, fortunately for my own layout and my own workflow, I've minimized it down to I think about 2 pages in general, and they're right next to each other. So we're gonna get into the soft key banks in just a second, but I just wanna overview the rest of the sections here because we've finally done it. We've got pretty much a job for everything, and it's a very specific job. So our quick key functions, they have a dedicated job. Our send plugin section has a dedicated job. The automation section has a dedicated job. The channel encoder has a dedicated job for this channel encoder, independent of this channel encoder. Scrub wheel has a dedicated job. Transport has a dedicated job. Our soft keys up here and over here have a dedicated job. And of course, the channels themselves have a dedicated job. And so we've really hunkered down and narrowed down on this idea of having as much one-to-one control as possible. Now, because those sections are static, right? They don't really ever change. So let's talk about our dynamic control parameters, which would be our soft key banks, and how you can use these to work linearly through the session. First, let's discuss the idea. The idea is that you're gonna wanna start on page 1 on both devices, and as you move forward through your session, you bank them at the same time, right? So you're gonna jump to page 2, kind of sort of at the same time, and then you get into some editing parameters. You're gonna bank on both devices, and you might toggle back and forth on page 3 and 4 on the UF8, depending on what you're doing. Page 4, I think, is more of like a drum editing workflow or a timing workflow. And page 3 is more like audio editing, kind of a workflow where you're cleaning up audio. And then on this device, you have your versions and copy and paste. So you can kind of sort of get into a two-handed workflow of editing. Again, I'm gonna show you all of this in action. On page 5, you have advanced functionality that really isn't available out of the box, such as converting plugins back and forth between U80X and U82, converting channels from mono to stereo, hiding and showing all tracks, and turning ARM on and off, which is accelerated real-time monitoring mode, specific to the Luna system. As you move forward in the UF1, you'll find your project level tools like track consolidation, bounce and bounce settings, the mixdown function, clip export, MIDI export, clearing your trash audio so you can make your project files a bit smaller, bookmark save, recall, and saving new versions. And then we get into some cool stuff like accessing the settings menu in your system, the feedback menu, all sorts of really cool stuff. And then finally, the last 2 pages are dedicated to tempo extract, changing this whole display, right? So you can go from SMPTE to time, just minutes and seconds. And lastly, you have your voice control and your instrument detection, which I absolutely love. The final thought in all of this is how SSL 360 itself kind of factors in, almost as if you have a whole new device and a whole new level of control in addition to what you can program for your DAW. And obviously I'm talking about like the SSL 4K emulation plugins that SSL offers, and how you have the SSL meter plugin that can run exclusively on this device's display. And then of course you get a lot of really specific advanced functionality with those plugins integrated into this device. And accessing them becomes incredibly simple because you just go from your layer 1 to say layer 2 or 3. And in effect, that's almost as if you had a completely secondary device. It's basically a virtual SSL UF8 system. It's really cool. All right, we've got our blank project. I've got everything reset to page 1. We've got some stems here that I'd want to import. And before we do, I just need to clarify for anybody who's not a Luna user, some of the really cool features that Luna has. They've recently implemented a thing called instrument detection. And so if you drag your stems in, it can analyze what kind of source audio is in each file and automatically add track names, color coding, things like that, right? The warp mode. This function, if you leave it on during your session, as you record new things, maybe you're recording them onto the same track, it's gonna run again in the background, and you might wanna turn it off. A lot of times for me, that means if I jump into a new project, my instrument detection is turned off and I wanna turn it back on at the top of my session. So this isn't really a parameter that you'd access all the time. I'm gonna turn it on once and then I'm gonna move on. So I've got it right here at the very, very back. It also means it's quick to access because you just page over until it doesn't page over anymore. And so for our voice control and our instrument detection, we can quickly open up the menus and toggle them on and off, which means you can just use your keyboard really quickly to either identify what microphone works with voice control, or you can open up your instrument detection settings and configure how you have that laid out. And again, toggle that on and off. The other thing that you can do is turn it on and off, right? So if I go to the assistant menu, you can see instrument detection, voice control are both off. If I press that button, now instrument detection is on. Now this is great because now as I go to import my stems, I can drag them in and add them. And you can see right away, it's analyzing tracks in the bottom corner. And as it does its thing, I'm gonna just back up one page here. And you can see now that it's just finished analyzing, it's identified these to be drums, you got bass, you got acoustic guitar, and all of this has been done for me. But the one thing is, my tempo is all wrong. You can see that as I zoom in, nothing's on the grid. And while I know the exact tempo of this project and I can just set it, it's probably the perfect time to demonstrate this whole extract tempo function. So if somebody sends you a project, you don't know the tempo, you can use this tool really quickly right from the UF1. So on the immediate previous page, I can just press one button and it's gonna extract the tempo for the entire project. You can see here, it gives you some candidates. Obviously I know that 82 was the correct tempo, so I'm gonna choose that one. And so very quickly, if I didn't know what my session tempo was, now I've got it really quickly. And we jumped from page 1 to page 2 really quick. Now I can jump back to the page, turn off instrument detection, and that's not gonna pop up if I do anything else. Now I can escape out of there, just go to the very top. And now we're at the top of our session here. What's the next thing you're probably gonna wanna do as you're building out your new session? Well, you're gonna wanna add your markers. And so I've got some predefined markers that are already typed out, right? So I believe this actually starts on the third bar here. Okay, so I'm gonna hit intro. And you can see as I'm adding these, I think it's a 4-bar intro here. We'll go ahead and add verse. I believe that is actually verse 2. And I wanna say, let's hear it. Okay, so this bar is the chorus. And that's as far as we'll go for right now in this demo. But you see how quickly it is. I don't have to do any typing, they're already programmed out. But if you needed a different marker, right? Like at the very, very top of my session, I like to have one that just says pre-roll. So I can just type that out manually with the new marker function. And the cool part is if you have the jog wheel, but you want to go somewhere specific, like say the verse, use these arrow keys. You can cycle between the markers that way, and it's super fast to jump around. And one of the other cool functions is that now I've given the scrub wheel a real purpose besides just navigating. So if you want to increase the size of all of your tracks, you press the scrub wheel and you can increase them all or decrease them all. And that's not the only way you can do that. There's another really cool way to fit everything on screen. I'll show you that later on. But it's just convenient to have that right next to your navigation. I know a lot of times I'll zoom around, I want something bigger, and then I escape out of there. And when you don't have anything on this channel encoder identified between navigation, focus, or nudge, it's gonna cycle the mixer. You can see here it's cycling through. But the other thing it's doing is scrolling. Now that's really cool because that means on the default functions, you can cycle and scroll through your timeline, but you can also scroll through your session and your mixer. So that becomes somewhat of a two-handed operation, which is pretty nice. Now the nudge function, I don't like nudge on my little toggle wheel here, right? I don't like that. So if I throw it into nudge mode, it actually becomes my zoom. So that's pretty handy. So you can cycle through your project, zoom in, zoom out, really efficient. And a lesser known fact and function of these arrow keys is that a down and up buttons can cycle through your tracks as channel selectors. Now that's really, really cool, because if I wanted to create a bus, I can find the end of one of my tracks, hold the shift key, and bank back to the very, very beginning and select on my controller the very first track, and then we can get into our quick key functions. So again, getting back to the whole muscle memory idea, not only do I want these devices to be laid out efficiently, but I also like to think less about things. And in my mind, it makes a lot of sense to make these quick keys match not only the functions, but also the general area of where you'd find the functions in the software. So those functions are create new track. Okay, so you've got create an audio track, instrument track, and bus, and that directly follows these quick keys. So the top one's create new track, a new instrument track, or new bus. Now that's really cool, again, because if I've got these tracks selected, I can press create new bus, and I've got this prompt that comes up, and obviously I'm gonna call this D bus for drum bus. I can use the command down arrows on my keyboard. If it's a send, I can choose what send to use, etc. There's a few other modifiers that allow you to choose some other things, but I've got these set up. I hit enter, and I've created a bus without using my mouse at all, and they're already set up and ready to go. So that's really cool. Now, in the event that I did want to access some sort of send command, in this send plugin section of the UF8, this has a dedicated purpose as well, which is great. And previously I had it laid out in a manner that I didn't think made a lot of sense, but now it's like very, very clearly labeled. So the word send, your send access is directly underneath that. Obviously, visually speaking, you'll know where to look now. Additionally, plugin control is conveniently located on the plugin labeled button. And then your channel cues are gonna be on the button labeled channel. So I feel like that's a lot more intuitively laid out. And the cool part is how easily accessible it is. You hold the button down, you choose ascend, and there you go. Of course, to escape out of there, you can press the pan button, and now VPots are controlling your pans. One of the other great things about this is using the flip function. So if I choose a cue or ascend, right, I can flip that parameter now onto my faders, and I can build a headphone mix specifically with my faders. That's really cool. It's like having a second mixer in the room. Let's talk about plugin control real quick. And to do that, I'm gonna load a very simple plugin. Let's load the 1176. Now this is a bit of a wish list item. I kind of wish this implementation was a bit better, and I will kind of show you why, and also talk about this channel encoder's function. Now for this function to work, you're gonna wanna make sure that you have a track selected. In this case, the 1176 is what I wanna control, and that is on my snare top. So I gotta make sure that that track is actually selected here. Then you press the plugin button. It's gonna ask you what plugin that you wanna control. In this case, tape, console, or inserts. This is an insert, and I only have one here, but this displays all 8 insert positions. And so I'm gonna click down on the 76, and that's really the first pain point for me, is how the names display. And I know that that's a bit of a Mackie Control Universal limitation, so I don't know how they're gonna fix that, but it would be amazing if they could. But I digress. Once you're in the plugin control view, this is kind of where I start to not really like it. It's different for every plugin. For the simple ones like the 1176s of the world, it works fine. You can see your input and output control, which is cool. You can do the whole 2-hand trick. You can change your attack, release. That's all pretty straightforward, and that's nice. But once you get into deeper plugins that have pretty much banks of control, then it gets really ugly. And one thing that I would really like to be able to do is to remove functionality. I think that that would actually speed this along to where I can remember where things are in the order. Otherwise, I have to read, and bank, and that's not really that fun or useful, which is why I prefer this channel encoder, because all I really have to do is hover my mouse onto the parameter, and now I have some sort of tangible control immediately, which is nice because it's immediate. I don't have to menu surf and dive into a few layers of menus to access. It's not really that I don't think these VPOTs function well. I think they function well. It's more so diving into different layers to access the function, whereas I can just quickly access, hover my mouse, and control away. Looking at the automation section, this is pretty self-explanatory. If we jump into the mixer itself, let's just choose our kick track here. You can see it says read right here. I can change that to touch or latch or trim or read or off. That's all dedicated function and extremely self-explanatory. Obviously the channels themselves are self-explanatory. You have channel select, which allows you to select the different channels within the bank. You've got solo, mute, etc. Panning, obviously really self-explanatory there. Now, one thing particular to my setup is if I have some channels soloed, you'll notice that this fine button actually lights up yellow. That's your solo clear. So if you got a bunch of stuff soloed a few banks over, you can press the fine button to undo all your solos at once. Jumping up to the soft keys bank, obviously this is gonna cycle through your soft keys here. The pan function is essentially your clear for your send plugin control. Selection mode, I almost never really use this. This is actually gonna make its way into my wish list video. I've got some thoughts on it, but for now, that's not really even redundant. I would say it's kind of useless for my workflow. The channel encoder, we discussed that, and we've kind of seen how these keys can interact with navigation. Again, these two are the only things that kind of live in redundancy mode, right? Because they do the same exact thing and there's no way to assign anything different to them. So for right now, this directional pad on the UF1 is just totally useless for me. Again, wishlist video item. All right, jumping over to this transport section, obviously this is one-to-one control and it just lives on as your forward, reverse, play, stop, transport functions, record. But right here, we've got a few very independent controls. So let's talk about it. So say that I have this kick track selected and I want to arm it for input monitoring and record enable it. Well, I've got those two. They're the very first buttons in this bank of keys. So turn on rec mode and turn on input monitor. You can see the track here has changed its state on screen. And the cool part is I actually get, if I kind of block some light, you should be able to see that glowing red. And if I turn it off, now there's visual feedback there, which is really cool. I wish that the input monitor was a MCU function so I could also give visual feedback on this, but the only real feedback you're gonna get is on screen. That's okay. The next two functions are what the icon shows. So you've got this cycle command, which is the loop functionality in your DAW. And then you've got the click, and both of those are MCU commands, and so they can give visual feedback on the controller, which again, more visual cues, the better. MCU is kind of limited in some regard, but maybe VST3 and SSL 360, maybe they can sort some of this out and give us even more feedback capability. Wishlist item. The final two controls are global controls. It is a toggle between the mixer and the timeline. And the next one, I actually have to load a plugin to show you. Let's load up a API Vision channel strip. And let's load up, say, Fab Filter. So say I had a bit of a chain going and it was a chain that I was working on and I wanted to make changes, but I also want to jump back and forth to the timeline, right? I can use the soft key number 2 to hide the chain and bring it back. Okay, that's very different than closing the window. You have to leave these windows up in order for that to work, but you can hide your chain temporarily, go do what you need to do, edit, etc., bring the chain back, make more changes, and you have that access right at your fingertips. I think that that's really nice. I find this especially useful while I'm tracking vocals. not only for myself or for someone in the ISO booth. So it's just a nice function to have. So that's kind of it for the static functions themselves. So let's escape out of there, and now let's talk about the rest of the soft keys because we've pretty much covered everything that is static on the devices. And we saw it with the very first batch of commands here with the track markers, and we do still have a few more things to talk about with these advanced settings. So the first thing is this screen in front of me is a 43-inch computer monitor, which is great because that means I can have my resolution set to 4K and everything still looks normal sized. It's basically like having a lot of screen real estate. But right now I have it set to 1080p and it is just massive in front of me. And so one of the ways I can get some real estate back is the second hotkey here. It's this browser function. So if I hit browser, now you can see the browser on screen is hiding, and that's great because if I'm in the timeline view, now I get a little bit of extra edit room back on screen. I like that, that's cool. The next two functions are really top of session functions. And to show you that, I'm gonna go to this mixer here. For anyone who runs Luna, if you run any sort of guitar amp sim plugins at all, you're gonna be very aware of the complication of U82 accelerated amp sims versus non-U82 accelerated amp sims. In other words, in order to run something like Amplitude, you can't run it in a DSP chip, right? So you have to make sure that your Luna tracks run with ARM turned off. Well, it's conveniently located right here. You can turn it on by clicking, but hey, who wants to do that? And also, like, it'd be so much faster to just have a spot to press a button and just reach for it without thinking about it. And so that's what I've done. I have ARM, I can turn it on and off right there. The next function that's really cool is console tracking mode. And that's another menu buried item here. So if I go into transport, I'd have to change this mode into console tracking mode. And again, the less clicking, the better in my opinion. And I already know if for the day, if I'm gonna be doing some sort of vocal stacking where I'm using the same chain, but just new tracks, maybe I'm recording acoustic guitar layers and I'm doing the same acoustic guitar, same mic on 2 or 3 different tracks. Console tracking mode is where you're gonna wanna live. It's very similar to the workflow that you'd find in using the Apollo with like Pro Tools, where your Apollo basically just becomes a front end for your session. And again, I know that at the top of my session for the day, that's what I'd be doing, so I can turn that on and off really quickly right there on page 1. Jumping into page 2 on both devices, now you get into the actual tracking workflows. And one workflow that I find myself doing all the time, especially when we're doing vocals here, let's say that I want to duplicate it and lay down a double. Well, that's where you're going to want to duplicate a track. So I can duplicate my track, but the WAV file doesn't go along with it. It's not a literal copy. It's just pulling the chain and the sends, and it's just duplicating that track without that content. That's really nice. Another function that's really cool is grouping, right? So obviously if you're doing like drum groups, very, very common. So I can highlight all my drums, I can add a new group, and oh, I don't want this bus in there, so we'll close that out and call this drums. Okay. Now I can solo, mute, etc. all my drums at once. I can add a new version for those. I can change my version. I can even hide and expand the version menu. Again, giving me a little extra real estate if I have a smaller resolution screen. Maybe you're on a laptop. Maybe you just have a smaller display. Every bit of real estate counts, and I love having the ability to manage my on-screen view without having to manually click and hit small little hot points on your graphical interface. Now, it's always gonna be a thing where maybe you add a new idea for a track and you decide, nope, I don't want that anymore. So that's where the delete track function comes in, right? Super handy, just delete it out, done. Pre-roll, right? That's really more of a count in kind of pre-roll. It's not a literal pre-roll. Another common function that I run into all the time is aborting the recording process. So let's say for this track, right? Let's load up channel here. And let's just say that on this vocal, I want to start recording, right? So I arm my track, I hit record. And now I'm going, uh-oh, I don't actually have signal. Something's went wrong. I don't want to keep this recording. I can just abort it. And there we go. Now, another really common situation while you're tracking is you want to overdub a spot, but you don't want to commit to the overdub necessarily, right? Like maybe you're still going to comp this later on, but you still want something to lead in to that performance. Well, that's where you'd want to duplicate the version or the take so that you can record over it and still keep the initial version. So let me try to at least demonstrate this for you guys. So to demonstrate this, right, I'm gonna hit this duplicate version, and now you can see on screen, I can version down and up. I have the same literal piece of wave audio content, but on version 2, I can hit play and I can record. And now that I'm done, I versioned down and I still have the original plus the punch that I did. That's really handy, and that's why I have this duplicate version. I think it's really nice. Of course, there is no avoiding having some level of redundancy here. Again, since I'm sharing this with people, I kind of have to be considerate that you might not have both devices. And so in the recording workflow on the UF1, you do have another area to access your sends and your cues. So let's jump forward and we'll now go to our MIDI workflow. So one of the most important things about working with MIDI is obviously your grid sizing. And I thought, what better function to include than some grid toggles here? So you've got a grid increase, so you have more divisions, and grid decrease, so you have less divisions. You also have the snap on off function, so you can just click and highlight to have things snap to the grid, or you can turn snap off and click and drag anything without being locked to the timeline. I find that's a lot more handy during editing audio. Since we're talking about MIDI, we do have the quantize menu we can open up. I don't have any MIDI in this session yet, but you can see it's there. And obviously you press quantize, it's gonna quantize it. We have octave up and down, so you can highlight your material and transpose it a whole octave. You can split note right from there. But now we get into something that I love for MIDI editing. One is resizing the whole session view so it fits the entire screen. I love that, that's great. So I can see my session at a glance. And if I were to have one track selected, right, I can expand it using the E key. And again, I can just resize the whole session really quickly. But let's go ahead and jump into that expanded view, because these next two functions are extremely valuable for not only MIDI editing, but say drum editing. We can change our views on the track. And that's great because the hit point or the hot point for this is really small here. It says view, and we can view our clip itself, which is the literal wave, right? It's a very small hot point to click on. And of course, like cycling through it sometimes is not the fastest, whereas cycling through is pretty handy and pretty nice. Once you're done working with audio and MIDI during tracking, you're probably gonna move on to editing, right? And so we cycle both our devices. Now we're in our audio editing functions, and let's talk about those. So a common thing is needing to increase the wave size, but at some point it gets so big you wanna just reset it back to 0. So I've included that. Obviously we've still got our resize session functionality, but say we wanted to split this clip. The cool part is if we have snap off, you can click right up to a wave and add your fades right to where you need them. So I can just click right there, add my fade really quick, add my fade out really quick. I can select the clip, I can mute it, I can turn my groups on and off. That's pretty handy to have while you're editing. Page 4 is kind of some of those other editing tools. Again, you might jump back and forth between these two pretty frequently. On page 2, it's kind of cool. You have a reverse wave function, which is great because I never really remember that shortcut. I don't want to remember all of them, but that's pretty nice. And if we jump up to our drums, let's make sure our groups are on here. And now I've got my group selected. I can press the E key to expand them. Maybe I want to increase the size a bit. That looks good to me. And now I want to get into warping, right? So change my track lane over to my track warps. And now I have this transient function where I can jump to the transients. And so I'll transient over. That looks like a kick. Looks pretty good. Snap is off. But you can see it's a really handy function to have to add your warps. Makes drum warping and drum editing a breeze. And of course I do have nudge here as well. So if you needed to nudge it, that's right in the relevant location. Comping, we've already seen some of that. Let's go to our vocal here. If I wanted to comp, I have my version up and down, right? And if I was working with a comp, I can split my wave where I need to, add my fades in and out, and I can select it. I can copy it, version up or down, and I can paste it. So that's about it for the editing functions. Let's jump into some of the mixing functions and some of the situations that require some advanced functionality. One of which is the hide track function. So say I just did not need this track, I can hide it. And if I want to bring it back, I can hit show all, and now all of the hidden tracks come back. Another really common one is working with stereo tracks. Like the session studios will send me tracks like this, right? And let's go ahead and I'll turn my groups off just for this situation. So I've got this stereo track, and let's say I run into a situation where the left side or the left mic of this overhead pair had just this crazy low end rumble. Well, I wouldn't necessarily want to process them both together per se. And so what I can do is convert this stereo track to two independent mono files. And you can see here, it's now created those. It's the same naming, but now it has a .l and a .r. And it works the exact same way, the opposite way. So I can convert these tracks to stereo. And we'll go back, cycle through, and we'll find our stereo file right here. Jumping back into the mixer here, another really cool function is the all plugins on off. So I can turn all processing in the session on or off really quickly. And the other function that I absolutely love is my U82 conversion tools. So sometimes if I'm running a really large session and I've got a bunch of U80X plugins in there running natively on my CPU, every now and then I'll start noticing that my system is running slower than normal, and it might cause maybe pops and clicks, or maybe the interface starts to run a little slow and laggy. And I find that if I use my Apollo to offload that processing, now all of a sudden it's faster again, or not really faster, but the experience is better. And so using this function, converting my U82 plugins to U80X, that's really nice. So let's check this out. This one is a U80X, so let's convert that one to U82. And boom, you can see it's changed on screen here. It says U82 at the top. Same thing, but the other direction. Now I've got the U80X running, and this is a global function. In other words, every single U80X in your session that can be converted will be converted, and that's really cool because any armed tracks that have U80X processing, obviously they're going to convert automatically if they can, but once you turn off the input monitored channel, it goes back to a U80X process. So, it might be one of those things where you're not even recording, you just want to offload some of that processing to your Apollo, or maybe vice versa. And that's just a really cool function to have. And then again, sometimes it pays to have some level of redundancy. I find that like if I'm in one of these other pages on the UF1 and I want to go back to ARM mode, cycling is a little slower. And so sometimes it's faster for me to just press 5 and then ARM on off and then escape back out of there. So it's just good to have some level of redundancy, and also, again, keeping consideration for those who may not have both devices at the same time. Next, I want to talk about the purple section here, which is all session-related functions. So let's say that I delete something out of this track, right? I can highlight it all and consolidate, and now it's one big wave. If I want to bounce, I can open my bounce settings and get really specific really quick with my settings there, and then I can press bounce. Obviously, it's going to bounce it down. I also find that I access consolidate and bounce in a similar time frame as my mixdown function, so that's why I have mixdown there, and we can start the mixdown process. If we page over one more, I have my clip export, so I can export out the individual clips within the session rather than the tracks themselves, as well as any MIDI that I might have. And then finally, we have this clear trash audio. So if I deleted anything that was completely out of my session, I can kind of shrink and manage my session's size with this function. Obviously, I can open up and recall previous versions of my project. or I can save a new version, or just simply save a bookmark or a save point in my session. The next page has some really cool stuff. So I can save my project as a template, right? If I wanted to. Again, this is another menu buried item. I have to go and track that down. Menu hunting is never fun, so it's nice that that's there. The next function is the alerts function. And a lot of times I'll load a project up and maybe the settings weren't the same and an alert pops up, but it goes away really quick. So with this one, it says right here, it shows that I couldn't do something because I had something isolated, and that's cool. So I can hide and open my alerts really quickly. I can also send some nice messages to Universal Audio really quickly, or I can access my project settings page really quickly. And this is a toggle, so I can get back really quickly too. And then finally, we're kind of right back to where we started here with the SMPTE time toggle for the display on the UF1, as well as the AI controls for Luna. So as far as like my kind of configurations, that's really where we jump off and we start to talk about SSL 360. And I do want to point this out because it's a real advantage of these controllers. Because for one thing, it actually means that this SSL UF1 has an additional functionality. And I really truly find that this is something that I only really do during mixing. So let's talk about it. We'll jump into the mixer here and load up on this channel the Meter Pro. Now this plugin itself is really cool. I really like it because it's got this integrated LUFS functionality, and I don't have to have this plugin window up to get this information. I can have it on this system. Again, this is why I only really access it during mixing, but it's cool because I can just press mode a couple times and now I'm cycled to that plugin on the UF8's display. I have VU meters, I have real-time analysis, but the main page that I find myself on is this LUFS page. And obviously, if you play anything, it's going to give you a readout, and that's really nice. But the final layer to this onion really is having access to the SSL 360 mixer, because it's almost like having a digital SSL console at your fingertips. In order to make that happen, you're going to select all your tracks in your session, and then you're going to load up the SSL branded plugins. So in this case, the VST3 version of the SSL 4K for me. Now, as far as how this actually functions and works, signal flow becomes extremely important, and you gotta consider that because there's an input side and an output side to the plugin, and that is before your tracks fader in your Luna session. So if you get into the theory, you're gonna wanna have your Luna track fader at unity, and then you're gonna mix theoretically with the SSL plugins fader, and you do that within SSL 360. So this is what that looks like, okay? You'd have all of these channels, let's reset that out. And each one of these plugins, for example, the kick, right? It has this fader that you'd be interacting with, but you're not gonna do it from within the plugin itself. You're gonna manage it in SSL 360. And if you jump into SSL 360, now this is your view. Of course, for me, I am going to want to make this more of like an overview because my screen is massive in front of me, but you kind of get the idea, right? You can get a glance at every single one of your SSL 4K plugins all at once. And on the SSL system, all you have to do is change your layer. Now remember, the most important part to me and my thought process is reducing redundancy, and that's where I love the idea of this guy not being slaved to this guy. So I can leave my UF8 in layer 3, but this kind of lives on in layer 1. That is also something that I wish you could change if you wanted to, because there are times that I would love for this to follow each other's layer. So again, wishlist item. One of the really unique benefits of SSL 360's mixer is that it changes the way you access your sends. And so if you remember, on my snare, I had a send set up. And so I can quickly access send 1 across the VPOTs much faster than I theoretically could in Luna. And I can still flip the fader and change that send level really quickly. Another nice thing is that the amount of information that you see on the display changes along with channel colors. So now all of the channel colors follow along throughout your session. The cool part is you can still access Luna's faders themselves without jumping layers. you can access it just by pressing this plugin button. Now, it's also kind of silly because you can just layer over and now you get your keyboard commands and all of your different custom commands back too, as well as panning, solo, mute, cut, etc. But the display changes, and so it's very possible that maybe you just want just the fader access here. And so now with this plugin icon disengaged, or this plugin button disengaged, I am controlling the actual Luna faders. If I assign pan to the VPots, now I'm controlling Luna's panning as well, actually in the session. So if we jump into Luna, you can see here, this is the actual pan pots of Luna, the actual faders of Luna, but I'm still in the SSL 360 layer. It's just another really unique way of controlling your system. And again, I find that I use this much more when I'm deep into mixing and I'm no longer editing, where I don't need those shortcuts and those functions anymore. I'd imagine if I had the UC1, this would become even more useful, because now each channel that I select, I have explicit control, one-to-one control over the EQ and the dynamic section of this SSL plugin. So really cool, really unique. Now for a final thought here, it really has taken some time to get to this point with these devices, primarily because it's taken some time for SSL to unlock the different sections of the device for me to program out additional commands. For a long time, the Sends plugin area was just inaccessible in Luna. And of course, the keyboard shortcuts editor is a massive part of this whole process. Without it, none of this would have been possible. So with that said, what do you think? Do you see yourself using something like this? Is there more to be left on the table? Should I have changed the layout in some way? Let me know in the comments. And a reminder, if you're looking to take your Luna knowledge to the bleeding edge of its capability, check out my Luna Master Course at thestevekinney.com. With it, you get a dedicated knowledge base of course material that updates as Luna evolves. So anytime there's a new feature, you're gonna get a dedicated spot to go and learn about it. In addition to the knowledge base, you get both my advanced SSL control profile and my Luna Stream Deck profile as part of being a course member, so you can learn with the tools that I use right alongside me. Check it out today. I'd love to see your progress. Really appreciate you guys watching. Subscribe for all things Apollo and Luna. Stay classy, keep rocking. See you in the next video. Cheers.